Hello, it's very nice to be with you today. My name's Daniel Jones and I work at the Centre for International Training and Education here at the University of Leicester. And today I'm going to be giving an introduction to EMI, English Medium Instruction. So what we'll be covering today is, first of all, untangling the terminology that's used. There's a lot of acronyms involved in this area. And we're going to look at the reasons for why there's been phenomenal growth in EMI globally. We're going to look at some of the issues that really have to be addressed when implementing and introducing EMI, thinking about it in terms of students, teachers, and education managers. So a bit of background about myself and what we do at CITE. During the year, what we do is we prepare students for entry to the university. So we're preparing students for study on pre-sessional courses in order to meet the entry requirement to join their academic program at the university. And then we offer in-sessional support during the year as well. And I work on credit-bearing modules as well for our exchange students, the Erasmus and study abroad students. And another role that I have, which is why I'm here today, is as program director for teacher development programs. We do an EAP, an English for Academic Purposes teacher development program, an EMI one, and we also do EMI consultancy. We've done this before in universities. We've gone out and visited universities in China, in Japan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and we also, well, previously when we could all get on aeroplanes, we've delivered it here in the UK as well. These are 1 week, 2 week courses, and we also do bespoke courses as well. And what we're doing there is we're working with lecturers and we're looking at the pedagogy and the approach and doing workshops to develop their skills in those areas. Let's start off with a definition. Makaro is a name that if you spend a lot of time in EMI, you get used to very quickly. His book, actually English Medium of Instruction, is a very good starting point. This definition is used across a lot of his work, but also it appears, it's pretty much a go-to definition when talking about EMI. It's, as I say, fairly well accepted, but it's not without its problems, and it does need unpacking a bit. We're going to compare it in a moment to CLIL, which you might also be familiar with. EMI, though, is the first thing to notice is that it's the use of English language. It's in the, it's in the title, English, and this is different to CLIL, as we'll see. So the first thing is around the use of English language. Second point is that it's about teaching academic subjects. Academic subjects, that means other than English itself. So we're talking about biology, STEM subjects, engineering, media, the academic content subjects. And that's important. We need to look at this in more detail because often it gets confused and blurred with things like EAP, English for Academic Purposes. Moving on, we look at it's delivered in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. It's quite convoluted, but I think we know what that means. What we're not talking about, for example, Chinese students getting on airplanes to come and study on courses at Leicester. We're talking about delivering English language programs in China, in Japan, in Germany, in Italy, yeah? Okay. Increasingly, I've started seeing the use of English medium education, EME, and also EMHE, English medium and higher education. These are still in the same area. The difference here is that this is much more of an umbrella term. It's covering not just teaching, obviously instruction is around teaching, it's covering the learning side of it as well, the flip side of the coin. And it's dealing with not just what goes on in the classroom, but outside of the classroom as well. So it covers much, much more. And I think that's why we're starting to see it used more, EME. It can cover aspects like pastoral support for students. We can deal with administration, institutional level support and policy, national level policies, and so on. Let's just cover some of the alternative terms that are used in contrast with EMI. Firstly, you might come across content-based instruction, or CBI. This tends to be used in North America, in the US, also in Canada, I believe. It's similar, though not identical, to CLIL. You might also see immersion used as a term in North America as well. More commonly, because it's used particularly across Europe, you'll see CLIL used, and there's often a little confusion or a little blurring between EMI and CLIL. So let's just see if we can unpick this a little bit. The first thing to note is that it's obviously not specific to English, although invariably CLIL is about English, but English is not defined there in its title, and it's not specific to English. It tends to be at the secondary and primary level, so it tends to be about schools, and it tends to be used describing the context in Europe. The most important point, though, and the most important differentiating point between CLIL and EMI is that CLIL has a dual objective of teaching both language and content. So it has these twin objectives. And EMI has a sole objective, which is around just the content. We'll deal with those problems as we move on. And while we're here, we'll deal with the ELT, the English language teaching acronyms as well, because they often get blurred in. I think you might see often EMI presented on a continuum, where over on one side you've got EMI, which is all about the content. In the middle you have CLIL, which is content and language 50-50, and over on the other side you have some variation of ELT, probably EAP, English for Academic Purposes, which is all about the language and or study skills. And that's true. That's certainly true as a way to describe that continuum from content through to language. But it does sometimes cause confusion about thinking that versions of EAP, whether it's EAP, English for general academic purposes, English for specific academic purposes, that then people start saying, well, is that EMI? And I think it's much clearer to say they're not. EAP, EGAP, and ESAP, these are support. They are support for EMI. They're not a subcategory of EMI. They're a support. They're an essential part of the support, and a successful EMI program will have an EAP program attached to it. But often it can be difficult to differentiate between EMI and particularly ESAP programs, English for Specific Academic Programs. So if you're looking at a program and you're trying to work out what it really is, and remember, what people call things is not necessarily what they are underneath, a very useful approach to take to understand whether a course is, or a program is, EMI, CLIL, or EAP, is to analyze it through the framework of what's called constructive alignment. Constructive alignment is about making sure that three big components in curriculum planning all line up. We start off with our ILOs, the intended learning outcomes. This is what you find in your overview documents for programs and courses, stating what it is that students are going to learn in a course or a program. Perhaps they'll be stated as, by the end of this course, students will be better able to, or students will have developed. Maybe there'll be can-do statements. So you start off by looking at that overview document and seeing, are they around content? Are they around language? So you can analyze it in that way and start seeing whether the intention of the course is to be teaching purely content or whether there are language aims there as well. Then you've got the course content and materials. Depending on what your role is, you might not have access to the full materials, PowerPoints and so on. But you should be able to have access to a scheme of work or a syllabus document that lists the syllabus items that will be covered. And again, you're doing the same thing. You're having a look through to identify which are the language points, which are the content points. And again, assessments at the end, seeing what is being tested. A useful thing to do is to have a look at assessment grading criteria. This is where often you'll have something like an EMI course, and it looks EMI all the way through, ILOs through to course content, and then you get to assessment and you'll see that the grading criteria for an essay at the end, you've got a column for knowledge and understanding key concepts. You've got a column for how well the student can analyze and apply the content. And then there's a column on the end that's about accuracy of grammar and vocabulary. And that suddenly is that's a language column there on the end in the assessment. So if that wasn't taught, if that wasn't stated in the ILOs and it didn't appear in the materials, we'd say it has poor constructive alignment across these three areas. So I think it's a very useful way to be able to look at courses to understand whether how purely EMI they are, or whether there's an element of CLIL, or whether it's more of an EAP course. The reasons for why countries and institutions are moving towards EMI programs. There are many reasons. Here are a few that I've pulled out from various literature and also from my experience of visiting EMI programs. The first and I think the most important one is, and we'll look at this in more detail about what issues it creates, is the promise of 2 for 1, that you're getting language and content for the price of one. Now that really is what CLIL promises, but people absolutely see the same in EMI as well. And we'll come on to the fact that students really do see that when they're enrolling. They see that the value of the language side for it. You can't get away from the fact that it's about money, to attract higher fee-paying international students, but also higher fee-paying domestic students as well. When you look at programs, for example, in Thailand, the international EMI programs can often be 2-3 times the cost of the home program. To boost and promote English language learning for the benefit of individuals, and perhaps governments are more interested in boosting and promoting the English language learning for the benefit of the economy. It's quite easy to identify it in countries like, say for example, Thailand and Vietnam have a big push for EMI, and that's very much about supporting the hospitality industry. But actually it's true of all sectors of the economy. You'd be hard pushed to find a sector of the economy that wouldn't benefit from internationalization. This is part of globalization, obviously. So this is why you find it in various formats in Europe at a government policy level, but you see it across all countries that are introducing and promoting EMI is underneath it, there is often a belief that it's going to benefit the economy. At a university level, to enhance the international profile of the university. This can be about prestige, which is a sort of a much harder thing to measure and identify, but there is a belief that sort of international programs and internationalization bring a prestige to the university. And certainly you're able to attract a more international faculty to your university, and then international students thereafter. And I think there's a belief that there's a knock-on there in terms of the impact that it can have to boost, for example, rankings would be a measurable thing there. And the last point is perhaps a little more cynical, is that it's what competitors are doing, so, well, we better get on with it as well. So once you see a trend, you see people moving in that direction, and that's again harder to measure that that's happening, but I think it's undeniable as well. So the growth that we see, we can categorize as follows. There's definitely horizontal growth. So by this we mean that across the sector, typically starting in private universities and then public universities playing catch up. So the growth is across the sector that way. There's also vertical growth as well. So the increase in EMI at an HE level is creating demand at a secondary school level to prepare students for EMI. And then you see it in, as I say, in the big policy planning, Ministry of Education level initiatives, like Japan's Global 30. There's a whole raft of them. If you look in any country's Ministry of Education, they'll have a 5-year plan to do this or that around bilingualism, or to introduce EMI, or to have a certain proportion of programs delivered in English by a certain date. So big Ministry of Education policies are driving that growth as well. And then what's off the back of that is, you know, they're providing funding as well. There's a big, the incentive is for universities to do this because they're going to get funding. At the heart of EMI are two promises. There's the promise that it will be of benefit to English language learning. And the second is that it will not be to the detriment of the content learning, so that the content learning will carry, would happen at the same pace and rate as if the course was delivered in an L1 in the first language of the students. Let's deal with each of these promises in turn. So the first one, well, it seems like a reasonable assumption. Yeah? If you immerse students in an EMI program, and so you can imagine that the language must come on in leaps and bounds. Yeah? So they go to university, they sit in lectures, and they're listening to lots and lots of English language in a highly contextualized form. They're then having discussions and seminars. They're working on problems. They're evaluating, all of this done in English. They go home and they do their follow-up reading. So they're reading articles and chapters from books in English. They have to write reports. They have to do their assessments in English. They are living and breathing this very authentic experience of using English. And for those of us with a background in English language teaching, we see this as, yeah, this is the goal. This is what we really want our students to be doing, to be learning in this very authentic way. Well, that's the promise, but it's a very, very idealized version of what a student might be doing. And it's not necessarily what's happening in all EMI programs. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, it's really hard to nail down how you measure those learning gains, the benefits. So Macaro, when he raises this question, he just ends up asking more and more questions. You know, it's like, better than what? How can we compare two programs? How can we compare two cohorts of students? The students, when they enroll for different programs, they're very different types of students. So it's very difficult to compare like with like there. What should be tested? How should it be tested? If you know anything about language testing, you'll know just how difficult it is to actually pin down what it is that you want to test and how you want to test it. Just on this same point of language gains, there's not a lot of research in this area, but here's a really interesting example from UAE. So this was taken from Macaro et al., and which is a big, it's a state-of-the-art paper that covers all the regions and what's going on globally. So here in UAE, students were expected to have IELTS 5 before starting the course. So that's for starting an academic English program, that's pretty low, but still only 10% of the students were able to then join the EMI course. They were expected to reach 5.5 after 2 years, and then to graduate with at least 6. I believe it's a 4-year undergraduate program. Rogier found that there was a statistically significant score gain in all 4 English language skill areas. So we start off going, yeah, great, the students learned some English over 4 years. The students' largest gains were in the areas of speaking, where on average they made half a band gain, so a 0.5 gain over 4 years, followed by reading, where they made nearly that level of gain. So if we look at this and we were to compare it with an EAP course, an EAP pre-sessional course, which takes, say, 10 weeks, typically a pre-sessional course at a UK university will be asking students to make a 0.5 or even a whole band improvement over that period of time. So in 10 weeks, doing what this EMI course is doing over 4 years. So this isn't particularly impressive, but it's only one study. Only you know, we certainly need more research to filter through to really see what's happening. But this study certainly doesn't bode well for delivering on the promise of language gains. Our second point is around the promise of no cost to content learning. So this means no detriment to content learning. So as I say, that they're going to learn at the same speed, the same rate as if they were on an L1 course. So, well, it can be dealt with quite quickly, actually, because the situation regarding whether content subjects are adversely affected is even less clear than talking about the language gains. We simply do not have sufficient evidence either way to talk about a negative impact. So the research just isn't there at the moment to really say whether students learn at the same rate. But this doesn't stop people promoting this as the promise of EMI, and that's what should be kept in mind. So to get into some examples of different EMI contexts, it's really useful to examine a couple, well, to look at these examples. The first criteria to think about is the different language combinations of the academic staff delivering the academic courses and the students. And I think this shows just how complicated it gets. When I first started visiting universities and working with academic staff, working with lecturers, I was very surprised by just all the different permutations and just the way that programs were set up, the different combinations of, first of all, language use. I'm using this terminology quite loosely. When I say English as a first language, I'm talking about people who learn English at home and then as a child, and then use it in society and in work and in general. English is an additional language referring to migrants who will speak another language at home and then will use English in an educational setting and certain other formal settings in their day-to-day life. And I'm also using it there to describe, for example, countries in South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, where perhaps there are first languages spoken in the home, and then English is used at school for education in certain education contexts and so on. English is a second language where it's learnt obviously as your second language, but for a use for a variety of reasons. Some of it academic, but also for social reasons, for travel, for cultural reasons like watching movies and so on. And then I'm talking about English as an academic language, EAP, for academic purposes, where it's much more specific, where we can say the majority of the person's engagement with English is purely for academic reasons, whether it's as a student or as a lecturer. We'll see an example in a moment. But really, they're not using English to travel or to socialize or those other things. So let's look at some examples. The first one is a Chinese university which has a China-UK partnership program. So within their general campus in China, there's a nice building with its own logo for a partnership. And the lecturers, you've got a flying faculty that comes out to deliver programs. So they are UK or international, and therefore their English language usage is either first language or second language. The students are all Chinese, and they have limited opportunities to use English in other contexts other than just the academic context. So they really are just EAP in what they use their English for. The lecturers are very concerned around students' levels. The students are very concerned about understanding what to do. And a lot of this is to do with the fact that their prior experience is very traditional. Everything they've done before is very different to what they're now being asked to do in an EMI program. Whereas the lecturers have a very mixed experience and very mixed approaches to their pedagogy in terms of how they're going to deliver the course. A second example is a Chinese medical university. I thought this was a very interesting one to look at because it's quite surprising. Well, it was surprising to me. So here we have all of the lecturers, very experienced faculty of lecturers, all of them Chinese, working in the university in some cases for 10, 15, 20 years. Many of them working on the EAP. I think the EMI program had been running for about 10 years. So very experienced lecturers, but still lecturing in a very traditional way. So they were doing the very lecture based. They're only using English only when they're in the classroom, really, because all of their staff meetings are in Chinese. So it's just limited to their interactions with students. Now, what's interesting is that the students were all Indian. So for reasons of capacity within, I guess, the Indian HE sector, particularly around medical degrees, a lot of Indian students then choosing to go to China to study for a medical degree. So the whole cohort is Indian. And they're using English as an additional language. So they've already, the sense I got from talking to them was that the majority had used English in a variety of contexts, such as at school and in certain other education contexts. Their approach, their understanding of the pedagogy was still very traditional as well. So they're quite accepting of a very traditional lecture-based approach. And what was interesting, even funny, was what they perceived as the issues. So when I spoke to the Chinese lecturers, I'd say, what was, what's the biggest issue you face? And they would say, oh, it's the students' pronunciation. It's terrible. And then I spoke to the students and said, what's the biggest issue? And they went, no, it's the lecturer's pronunciation. It's terrible. So you can see how here, the way that it's set up, the way that we've got different uses of English language, we can see how this then influences the issues that then are faced and that then arise in the practicality of delivering the EMI program. One more example is a Japanese university. And this is interesting, I think quite typical across the region in terms of approach that comes from a national policy that is looking for an expansion of EMI programs. And then the next step, so this is very top down, an EMI is implemented in that top down way. So it comes from a Ministry of Education. The institution then decides to bring in EMI. They decide to start building these programs. And the idea is that if we build it, then the people will come. That if we build it and we set up our EMI program, then eventually we will start attracting this international cohort of students. But for the time being, while they're building it, the lecturers are all Japanese, the students are all Japanese. The language, their English language experience, if you're familiar with the Japanese context, is there aren't opportunities to socialize or use English in, it's hard work to find other contexts in which to use and practice your English. So they're using English language pretty much exclusively just in the classroom. That's a very important factor there. And then what it means is that the lecturers have, first of all, very anxious over their own level of English and about whether they're at the right level to be delivering EMI, and then concerns over their students' level as well. And the students, as with the medical university I just talked about, they have concerns over just really understanding what it is that's expected of them. And both of them very comfortable in a very traditional pedagogy there. So what you find here is that you've got Japanese lectures, which previously they were delivering their lectures in Japanese. Now they are asked to deliver them in English, but because their students are Japanese, it's much more bilingual. So they're code switching. They're moving across to Japanese to perhaps explain tricky terminology or to kind of just get the lesson moving if everyone gets stuck. So you can see that happens, but the problem is that they're hoping one day to be joined by this international cohort, and all of that would have to be then managed or stopped perhaps. So as an aside, it's interesting to pick out some information from this survey by Nicola Galloway and colleagues. This is a survey of Japanese and Chinese universities. I don't think we should be particularly interested in the column for staff. The numbers are quite low there. It's only N23. But if you look at the number of students, that's a significant number. And what's really interesting is that even though EMI is on paper is all about the content and is not about the language learning, 40% of the students are selecting, they're enrolling on EMI programs because the main reason is that they want to learn and improve their English. So it's really interesting that the students perceive that as one of the big driving reasons for doing an EMI course. So just a little more, and just to expand a bit more on this idea of code switching and bilingualism and where we see that going. Increasingly, EMI pedagogy is moving away from an English-only approach. I think that comes from influence from EAP and ELT, English language teaching, that you should be immersed and it should be an English-only environment. And we're moving towards much more of a pragmatic approach that acknowledges the reality of what's in front of you. So these two quotes here from the Galloway survey. The first one: so I'll describe the outline of the class using English, and then I provide more detail, I'll use Chinese. So they kind of, you know, the core content is in English, and then they color in a bit using Chinese. Yeah. Similarly, Richard says, when students don't have experience of these topics in high school or any other Japanese context, and they're reading about it in a language that's challenging, it's like scaling a wall, and there's little places to put your hands and toes, and it's slippery. It's our job to help them work out bigger handles for them. If I sense their bewilderment, I throw in a little Japanese. As we come on to you know, what's required of EMI pedagogy, this is exactly it. It's like deeply contextualizing the learning for the students. But a word of caution: taking this more nuanced approach brings risks. The code switching by the lecturer can also be viewed, and Galloway notes this, can be viewed negatively by the students. As we see here with our example of Ruolan and Richard, is they're negotiating their way through the content, making decisions. They think they're helping their students. The students can see this as a big negative. They think the reason that the lecturer keeps switching back into L1 is because their English is no good. They've got a lack of proficiency. So yeah, I think you always need to be cautious about how students will interpret some of these decisions. I think it also can cause problems with the constructive alignment that I was talking about, that it's not always clear, it's not always as easy to see that line between the ILOs, the course material, and the assessment as we draw a line between the three. But on the whole, it's more acceptable to utilize first languages in instruction and learning activities. But we have to balance that against it is at its extreme. I think it's quite common to hear about EMI programs where the ILOs, the course material, the assessment, that's all been developed in English. And then what happens is that when we get into the classroom, even the PowerPoint is in English, but the lecture as it's delivered is delivered in L1, so in Chinese or Japanese or whatever the L1 is. And I think that's quite common. That's happening quite a lot, and that's one of the big risks about the use of code switching and bilingualism, about where is the line, and trying to give the lecturers guidance over where they should draw that line. But interestingly, there seems to be a move towards describing programs as bilingual. Much more are being called that now, and also interestingly describing them as bilingual with English. So that brings us on now to a change in pedagogy, a change in how courses are taught. And it's really important that when implementing an EMA program, that it's not all just about thinking about language levels of either both the students and the lecturer, but it's also about the pedagogy that's going to be used by the lecturers. And this is of equal, if not more, importance. I do have to say before we look at this, that this is a simplification. I'm not suggesting that all L1 lecturers, teach in the same way. We all know some very effective lecturers who are very engaging and who are reliant on direct instruction. Similarly, there's nothing new or special about EMI pedagogy. I think it's already being used in lots of HE pedagogy already in L1. And also another factor in there is that a lot of this is very discipline and content dependent. So there's a lot of variation depending on what it is that you're teaching. Still, having said that, I think we can see these on a continuum that, and from my experience, I certainly, this is what I've seen, is that there is a traditional approach to teaching in HE. It comes from, how I learned is now what I do. So, I was taught very successfully, obviously, because I've become a lecturer and so on, how to teach in this way. And then your beliefs are grounded. Your beliefs about how you teach are grounded in that way. And this is a lecture-based direct instruction approach. It's about knowledge transmission. There is limited interaction. Excuse me. The EMI pedagogy that has to be introduced is often a new approach for lecturers who are more experienced in a traditional approach. It still has direct instruction, but there is an emphasis on interaction, and it's built on a constructivist approach to learning. So it's reliant on students deconstructing and then reconstructing knowledge, and then being able to evaluate and apply. And a lot of this is supported through designing learning activities that ask students to do that. Now, there is obviously, for decades, there's been a debate within education over approaches to, how do people best learn, and I don't want to be drawn into whether the constructivist approach is valid or what we should take from it, but to approach it from a much more pragmatic, practical stance. So the example I gave of the Japanese university, where previously a very experienced lecturer was perhaps delivering, I'd ask, how do you teach at the moment? And they say, well, I give a lecture, a 1-hour lecture, and I speak in Japanese, and students take notes. If there's time for questions at the end, then I deal with it that way. I said, okay, and what are you going to do next? It's like, well, I've got to do it in English. And it says, well, can you speak for an hour in English? It's like, oh, right, well, and that was quite a shock, thinking, well, first of all, can you do it? Do you want to be doing that? Is that what you want your job to be now, is to prepare your notes in English and then be delivering in English? And then the flip side of that is, do you think your students can listen in English for an hour and remain engaged? How do you know that your students are engaged? How do you know that your students are following the content? So I think from a practical point of view, it's that the traditional lecture-based direct instruction with minimal interaction is just too problematic. And therefore, from a practical point of view, it's much easier to sell an EMI pedagogy to convince lecturers that this is a more effective way to approach their teaching. So the EMI pedagogy that we would promote is, first of all, interactive between teacher and students. We have an initiation, then a response, and then feedback. What we talked about earlier is that it should be deeply contextualized. It should be about building on schemas, so building on existing knowledge. Very importantly, students need time. First of all, to answer, they need time to consider, to reconstruct the knowledge, and they need activities where they deconstruct and then reconstruct that learning content. They need opportunities to evaluate, to test and apply the content as well. And what this means is that the teacher's role is going to change. So from being primarily a lecturer, they're now taking on more roles in terms of being facilitator, of setting up activities and running activities. They're a resource in terms of directing students to further guided independent study. They're a motivator as well. So they have to keep their students engaged throughout the course. And possibly they're also a language resource as well. So what do lecturers need? First of all, they need clarity over aims and outcomes of the program. And this really comes back to what I was talking about earlier, which was the constructive alignment. If there is a clear line that can be drawn from the aims and outcomes through the program, through to the assessment, then this is going to help lecturers a lot to understand what it is that they're required to do. And this will help then with the understanding and getting clarity over the expectations about their roles and responsibilities. If lecturers are no longer expected to solely deliver lectures, what is it that they're expected to do? And then they're going to need support in order to do that. So they need an accessible, responsive, continuing professional development program. So they need guidance. If that isn't a skill set they have, they need help developing that. There needs to be a coherent, joined up institutional level policy as well to support the EMI program, thinking about things like assessment, academic honesty, integrity, that sort of thing. And finally, and really importantly, to create a positive and supportive working environment. So things like a CPD program help a lot there, but I get a sense sometimes that particularly when you get this top-down implementation of EMI, for those who have been working quite happily in their first language delivering a program, now they're being asked to flip a switch and move over to doing it in English. This is incredibly stressful and really problematic for them. So to manage that change is really important. Otherwise, it can have a really negative effect on individuals, but also generally on the work environment. The students, similarly, they need clarity over the aims of objectives of what it is they're doing, and this will help them to understand the expectations of how they study. And what they need is an EAP support program. I haven't spoken too much about this, but it's absolutely essential that there is a complementary EAP support program, an English for academic purposes program, that is going to either prepare students for entry onto the course or support students while they're on there. And what's really important there is that your EAP staff are working really closely with the content EMI academic staff. They really need to be sharing content, understanding the objectives of the program and then of each course and module. A few thoughts on where this might be going. And if the last couple of years are anything to go by, I'm not particularly good at predicting the future. I think we can learn from the internationalization of UKHE and see what's gone well there, and perhaps look to see where things have not gone so well. When students are included and valued and they are brought into that community of practice, and they are made to feel as if they're an integral part of the university and valued members of the university community through ensuring that they have appropriate support, but also that within the programs that it's accessible for them, then that's when it goes well. I think when students are asked to pay a premium, a higher fee for an international program, and here now moving back over to thinking about EMI, students will be very aware that they're paying higher fees, and they are already increasingly vocal in their demand for value for money. And this is going to link on to the final point, but they're going to express their dissatisfaction when things don't join up and things don't work. I think there's going to be a lot more research coming through, I think, in the pipeline, where we're going to see, cumulatively, we're going to see the evidence for whether the two promises of EMI are delivered on. So the language, whether students, what sort of language gains they make, but also whether it's at the rate of learning is the same in EMI as in L1. I think we will continue to see national and institutional policies. I think they will ebb and flow. I think they will. You see these sometimes countries pushing for internationalization, and then it recedes back a little bit as they perhaps defend more cultural beliefs, and they have concerns over erosion of cultural beliefs and erosion of use of L1 and so on. So I think it will move to and fro, but the general movement will always be towards internationalization and therefore EMI programs. And all of this links into quality assurance. I think there's going to be an increase in having to demonstrate that through curriculum documentation and procedures and frameworks and policies and regulations, and all of that is going to have to develop so that it can demonstrate the quality of these EMI programs. And for all of the stakeholders, they will be able to identify when programs are succeeding. My final thoughts are around questions you should ask when you encounter an EMI program. And this really just summarizes some of the ideas I've talked about in this session. First of all, understanding the criteria. So this is understanding the criteria for the staff and for the students, how they are selected and admitted onto the program. Understanding the criteria for how the staff are admitted. Just seeing it's not all about the language, but it's also about experience and skills in EMI pedagogy, or a willingness to develop in that direction. And then for students, understanding the criteria that are used for them to be admitted onto the program as well. Not only, but primarily around language level there. The middle three here are again reiterating the point I've been making around constructive alignment, of really having a look at program ILOs and seeing what it is that the person who designed and developed the program, what it is that they think the students are going to achieve by studying on the course. And similarly at the back end, what they will produce in their assessments. So what are they going to be assessed on? What tasks do they do? And then really asking questions about what happens in the middle. What happens with the materials? Are they, are they developed in English? Is the instruction in English? And then the last two ones there is that we've got what support are given to staff and what support are students given. So I just spoke about that just briefly, thinking about the continuing professional development for staff, as well as the EAP support that's given to students. And in closing, just some resources. These are linked to in the references below, but I'll just briefly speak about these. There's Nicola Galloway set up a network that can be found here at this URL. It's called Teaching in English in Global Contexts. If you're interested in EMI and starting to understand the people who work in that area, that's a very good resource to start with. If you really want to read about it, then this quite recent book, this 2018 book by Ernesto Macaro is excellent and is very comprehensive. Two shorter articles. Julie Dearden's report from 2015, which is available through the British Council webpage for download, is very good. Perhaps getting a little dated now, but still well worth reading. This 2018 State of the Art article, though, is excellent and really gives excellent detail regionally what's going on. And I say 2018, so it's pretty up to date as well. Okay, so finally you see my references there. And that brings me to the end of this talk. Thank you very much.